The main fuel valve heaters have been turned off in preparation for engine start. The main engines on the orbiter will actually be started at 6.8 seconds, and it takes 3 seconds for them to reach 90% thrust.
This is the first commercial flight for the shuttle.
Yes, it is. Something we're very proud of. We have 2 satellites to carry up for commercial companies.
And they have been paid for, bought and paid for.
It's true.
The space has been bought and paid for.
And it was a bargain for them.
A bargain for them, sort of a loss leader. The price goes up in about a year or so,
That's true.
I gather. $8 million for one satellite, $9 million for the other. The first satellite will be deposited in space about 8 hours after launch.
The shuttle is now on internal power.
On the 6th orbit, I believe.
That's correct.
And the other communication satellite will be deposited tomorrow during the 22nd orbit.
Correct.
The engine gimbal or movement check of the main engines of the orbiter is underway to ensure that they're ready to control the flight.
The voice of Hugh Harris.
Up on the 3-minute point.
T-minus 3 minutes.
T-minus 3 minutes and counting. Everything going smoothly. T-minus 2 minutes, 55 seconds. The liquid oxygen valve for filling the external tank is closed and pressurization has begun. After the tank is pressurized, the hold capability is limited to 3 minutes and 36 seconds.
4 astronauts on board. Vance Brand, Bob Overmeyer, Bill Lenore, and Joe Allen.
Will be retracted shortly.
4.5 million pounds
seconds and counting.
of spacecraft
The fuel cell's ground
out on the launch
supply
pad.
of oxygen and hydrogen has been terminated, and the vehicle is now on its onboard supply. And the gaseous oxygen vent arm is being retracted, lifting off of the nose of the external tank.
The little beanie cap is being pulled away.
Counting. The main engines have been moved to their start position, and the astronauts have cleared the caution and warning memories of their onboard computers and verified that there are no unexpected errors. 1 minute, 57 seconds. The liquid hydrogen vent valve has been closed and flight pressurization is underway.
The main engines ignite at 6.8 seconds before launch.
1 minute, 45 seconds. The computer will automatically verify the readiness of the main engines at the T-minus 1 minute point. Coming up on 90 seconds. T-minus 90 seconds and counting. Everything going smoothly as we look for liftoff of STS-5.
On this flight, the first spacewalk by American astronauts in some 9 years. That'll take place on Sunday.
20 seconds and counting.
115.
The liquid hydrogen tank now is at flight pressure. Coming up on the 1 minute point in our countdown. T-minus 1 minute and counting. The firing system for the sound suppression system on the pad is armed. T-minus 55 seconds. The hydrogen igniters under the orbiter's engines have been armed. These devices are used to ensure that any hydrogen flowing through the engines prior to ignition does not accumulate, causing a small explosion. T-minus 40 seconds. We're just seconds away from switching command of the countdown from the ground computers to the onboard computers.
And seconds away from the fifth flight of the Columbia.
Recorders are on. And we have a go for auto sequence start. T-minus 21 seconds and counting. The SRB nozzles are being moved through a test pattern to launch position. T-minus 15 seconds. 13, 12, 11, 10. We are go for main engine ignition.
7, 6.
We have main engine ignition. 3, 2, 1, and solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the first operational space shuttle mission with 2 satellites on board.
Beautiful. Look at that glow.
The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Pitch program. Roger, roll, Columbia.
Houston now controlling. Mission control confirms roll maneuver started.
A magnificent launch.
20 seconds. Thrust looks good. 26 seconds. Roll maneuver completed. 30 seconds. Columbia now 1 nautical mile in altitude. Throttling engines down to 85% as programmed.
Crew of 4 on its way.
Mark 40 seconds. Columbia now 2.5 nautical miles in altitude. 1 nautical miles downrange. Mark 50 seconds coming up now in period of maximum aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle. 55 seconds, Columbia now 4.5 nautical miles in altitude. Mark 1 minute, pass through max Q, still looking good. Throttling engines back to 100%, giving a go at throttle up.
Columbia, this is Houston, your go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up.
Mark 1 minute, 10 seconds, Columbia now 7 nautical miles in altitude, 5 nautical miles downrange. Mark 1 minute, 20 seconds, Columbia now 10 nautical miles in altitude, 7 nautical miles downrange.
Columbia, Houston, we're monitoring a slightly depressed trajectory expected because of the headwinds. Roger, understand.
1 minute, 35 seconds. I was Capcom Bob Stewart advising the crew a slight depression because of the headwind. Columbia moving out now as pre-planned on 3 good engines. 1 minute, 45 seconds. Brand over Mare, Lenore, Allen now coming to the last traces of the Earth's atmosphere. Columbia now 19 nautical miles in altitude, 18 nautical miles downrange.
And they're riding upside down.
Mark,
soon
2
that won't
minutes.
matter.
Standing by now for solid rocket booster separation confirmation.
Roger, PC.
Columbia now 25 nautical miles in altitude.
And there is the separation of the solid rocket boosters.
2 minutes, 15 seconds. Confirmed solid rocket booster separation.
On the last flight, they fell into the Atlantic Ocean
2
and
minutes,
sank.
22 seconds. Onboard guidance
hope we have that
conversion is
corrected.
programmed. Columbia is now steering for a precise window in space for main engine cutoff. 31 nautical miles in altitude, 43 nautical miles downrange.
Main engine cutoff, the next big step.
Columbia, this is Houston. Your first stage was low on performance this morning. Okay, fine.
2 minutes, 2 minutes, 49 seconds. Columbia now 37 nautical miles in altitude, 58 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 6,500 feet per second.
The shuttle still riding under that huge external fuel tank. And that tank will be jettisoned a bit later on. The only part of the shuttle that is not reusable.
2-engine TAL capability. 2-engine TAL capability.
3 minutes, 15 seconds. That call up by Capcom Bob Stewart says that the Columbia now has landing capability at Dakar Airport should 1 engine go out. 3 minutes, 25 seconds. Columbia now 46 nautical miles in altitude, 88 nautical miles downrange. 3 minutes, 32 seconds. Return status check and mission control by Flight Director Tom Holloway. The crew aboard Columbia given a go to continue. 3 minutes, 40 seconds.
It appears to have been a perfect launch.
Altitude 105 nautical miles downrange. Standing by now for negative return.
Negative return is sort of a point of no return. They cannot return now to the launch site. They cannot.
Brand over Mare and Company committed to space travel. They can no longer turn around and return to the launch site. Mark 4 minutes, 5 seconds. Columbia now 52 nautical miles in altitude, 132 nautical miles downrange.
And they all got their astronaut pins because they're above 50
Columbia
nautical
now
miles
traveling at a
altitude.
velocity
So
of
they are
8,900
in
feet per
space, but
second.
they're not quite in orbit as yet.
That's correct.
This is
Mark 4 minutes, 30 seconds. Trajectory plots and mission control still on target for Columbia. Brand over Mare, Lenore, Allen swiftly moving downrange now. Now 50 or 174 nautical miles downrange.
They're looking for an orbit 160 nautical
4 minutes,
miles
50 seconds.
above the
Columbia now
Earth.
57 nautical miles in altitude, 192 nautical
And
miles
that, I think,
downrange.
if my
Velocity now
arithmetic is
reading
correct, is
10,500 feet per
184
second.
statute miles.
Columbia, Houston, your go at 5 minutes. Roger, go at 5 minutes.
Mark 5 minutes, 10 seconds. Columbia now 58 nautical miles in altitude, 222 nautical miles downrange.
3 astronauts are sitting in the upper deck, the flight deck, and they probably have a
10
view
minutes,
of what's
standing
ahead.
by for Prestamico.
1 astronaut down below. Prestamico. That means go ahead to main engine cutoff. MECO, main engine cutoff.
Columbia, you have pressed to MECO.
Even if 1 engine is lost, they can now achieve orbit.
5 minutes 44 seconds. A press to MECO call from Capcom Stewart says, should Columbia lose but one engine, press on, keep flying forward. Columbia's engines have enough energy to achieve normal altitude and velocity at cutoff.
The voice of John McLeish at Mission Control in
58
Houston.
seconds. Columbia now 59 nautical miles in altitude, 307 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 13. Standing by for single engine TAL.
Columbia, Houston, you have single engine TAL capability.
Roger. 6 minutes, 15 seconds. That report from Capcom Stewart indicates if a two-engine failure occurred, the crew aboard Columbia is capable of an emergency landing at Dakar Airport. Mark 6 minutes, 25
Dakar
seconds.
in Senegal is
59
where they
nautical
would
miles
go.
altitude,
Correct.
360 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 15,400 feet per second. Mark 6 minutes 40 seconds. Columbia pitching over now, diving to increase velocity level off altitude, giving Columbia a most favorable attitude. Columbia now 59 nautical miles in altitude.
Very little has been said from the spacecraft. A quiet crew on board, which is not unusual.
It's a good sign.
It's a good sign.
Columbia now 59
Means they're very relaxed.
True.
445 nautical miles.
Enjoying the view.
Velocity now reading 17,900 feet per second. 7 minutes, 12 seconds. Standing by for single engine press to MECO.
Columbia, you have single engine press to MECO capability.
Copy.
We now can go all the way on
25
one of the three
seconds.
main engines.
That report says Brandon Overmeyer can achieve normal engine cutoff targets even if two engines go out. Columbia now 58 nautical miles in altitude, 535 nautical miles downrange.
I think it's worth reminding everybody that when the shuttle comes back, it comes back without engines. It comes back as a glider and has one shot at landing and only one shot. And that landing is expected to take place next Tuesday, early morning, at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
Main engine slowly being throttled back now. Should be throttled at 65% at 6 seconds before main engine cutoff. 8 minutes. Flight Dynamics Officer Ron Epps reports Columbia's velocity at 23,000 feet per second. 8 minutes, 12 seconds. Columbia now 59 nautical miles in altitude, 675 nautical miles downrange. Velocity now reading 24,400 feet per second. Mark 8 minutes, 25 seconds. Standing by now for main engine cutoff.
Main engine cutoff will be followed by the separation of the huge external tank.
Copy, good MECO, Columbia.
80,000-pound tank, which will be
shutdown.
drained almost
Columbia now
dry by
space for
that
a
time.
fifth time, this time with a four-man crew. Standing by now for external tank separation. Columbia now 795 nautical miles downrange. Go, no, go status check and mission control by Flight Director Tom Holloway for the first ohms burn and shutting down the auxiliary power units.
We should hear
Confirming
confirmation.
external
There it
tank
is.
separation.
And that will break
Columbia
up
now
and
performing
fall
an evasive
over a
maneuver,
wide
moving below and beyond the external tank.
pattern in the Indian Ocean.
Correct.
It is hoped that they've warned all the ships to stay away. The external tank is the only part of the shuttle that is not reusable. There were two parachutes on board that helped the solid rocket boosters drift into the Atlantic a few moments ago, two parachutes that were used on the second shuttle flight. So they're beginning to make use of some of the parts that were used on the earlier shuttle or in the earlier shuttle flights. Let me just move down here and grab this model and see how this works. We have a toy to play with. And just explain that in about 8 hours, the shuttle will really become operational when, with the payload bay doors open, Ray, we'll be able to see that there are two satellites on board, two commercial satellites, and one of them will be launched. And they'll open this little sun shield, which is sort of like opening a clam or an oyster, I guess.
Correct.
And you comfortable with this?
Sure.
I'm frightened I'm going to drop it. And there are a couple of springs on board.
That's correct.
And what happens then?
Well,
Take that.
right. The satellites begin spinning to stabilize them as they come out of the payload bay, and then they come out spinning and are ejected by springs and will come out. And they have a motor, a payload assist or PAM module on the back end, and once they're deployed, about 45 minutes later, the this engine lights They are going into an elliptical orbit, and then about 5 orbits later, that is separated, and there's another motor in the back end of the satellite that fires that puts them in a geosynchronous orbit.
Okay, and we might just remind everybody that an ohms burn is about to take place, or has just taken place. Just taken place. And the ohms burn is the orbital maneuvering system.
Correct.
A rocket engine, or 2 or 3. And that helps boost the shuttle into the orbit it hopes to achieve. There will be 2 ohms burns today.
To raise the orbit.
To raise the orbit to 185 miles above the Earth. Let's just go back to our little satellite, if for no other reason than I like to play with it. The satellite will launch itself and will eventually find itself at about 22,300 miles above the Earth in geosynchronous orbit. You want to explain what geosynchronous means?
Well, that's actually when the speed of the satellite equals the rotational rate of the Earth, so it stays over one spot on the globe all the time.
All the time. And to repeat, one satellite will be launched in about 8 hours during the 6th orbit, and the second satellite will be launched tomorrow during the 22nd orbit. So it will be a rather busy day today for the 4 astronauts on board. Also, we might remind everyone once again that this will be the first flight in about 9 years that will have a plan on board for 2 of the astronauts to walk in space.
That'll be a very exciting time, I think.
No question about it. And they'll be testing out their new spacesuits, won't they?
That's the purpose of this spacewalk, is really to check that that suit performs well.
And what, you've got a hunk of that suit down there, a hand, if we could bring that up. And that, this is a hand that's right off. Why don't you explain just how those suits are manufactured, Ray, okay?
Right.
I'm going to put that on, or?
This spacesuit is a little bit different from the Apollo suit in that we use modular components so that we don't have to build separate suits for everyone. They actually are put together as needed. This is one of the gloves. It's actually Bill Lenore's training glove that they use in the water tank at the Johnson Space Center.
Bill Lenore is much smaller than I am. I remember when I tried one of these on a few months back, it fit.
They need to be snug so you get good feel in the fingertips, so they are difficult to get on.
And they'll be performing an awful lot of work eventually on future missions with wearing suits such as this. We might just check in with mission control. Everything seems to be functioning normally on board the spaceship. Got off on time. And I think that's the second in a row, and the countdown was absolutely perfect. And we've heard very, very little from the 4 astronauts on board. And Ray Seddon, our astronaut colleague here today, tells me that the less you hear, the fewer words you hear from them, means the better they are performing.
This is Shuttle Control Houston, 13 minutes, 53 seconds mission elapsed time. We have a status report on the first ohms burn from Flight Dynamics Officer Ron Epps. The time of ignition was 10 minutes, 30.8 seconds. The delta V read 231.5 feet per second. Burn duration 2 minutes, 20.8 seconds. Ohms 1.
I think now we're going to take a look at the launch, replay the launch.
We have main engine ignition, 3, 2, 1, and solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the first operational space shuttle mission with 2 satellites on board, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
That was the launch of the 5th shuttle flight, 14 minutes and 47 seconds ago.
Looks absolutely perfect.
20 seconds for us looks good.
And it looked absolutely beautiful from down here and is functioning just the way NASA had anticipated it would. And we're looking forward now to a 5-day flight with landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California next Tuesday morning. And Ray Seddon, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We'll be talking with you, I think, a bit later on today. And now,
overwhelming day for the 5th launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia. 4 astronauts, 2 satellites will be kicked into orbit, 2 scientist astronauts. Later in the week on Sunday morning, will be floating and working with space. It was an exciting launch, and all is going well for the 5th flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia into space. Good morning, I'm David Hartman. I'm at the Kennedy Space Center for Good Morning America. Also, as you have probably already heard this morning, the communist leader, the leader of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, is dead. Coming up in this hour, we'll be getting some reaction from former President Gerald Ford live from California. And we have also with us the wives of 3 of the astronauts who are now in orbit around the Earth. We'll talk with them as well. First, let's go. Well, that's good news, especially to 2 women who are sitting here right now with us. Bev Brand. Good morning, Beverly.
Good morning, David.
Whose husband is the commander of the Space Shuttle. He's up there 184 miles up now, going around. And Liz Obermeyer, good morning. It's Kit. Excuse me, Kit Obermeyer. Excuse me. Nice to have you with us. Your husband, of course, the pilot of the Space Shuttle. Bev, what did you expect today? How did you expect to feel, and how did your reaction compare to what you thought was going to happen?
It was a lot more exciting. This is my first launch, and it was much more thrilling than I expected. We anticipate a lot, and you hear everyone's stories about how you just won't believe, and you just don't believe until you're actually here. It's the most thrilling thing I've ever seen.
Scared at all?
Not scared. Anxious and very excited, but not scared.
Kit, how about you?
Oh, I have to agree with Bev. It's been 13 years that we've been working. And at the beginning, we were learning, training, and I say we because I really felt like I was a part from the beginning. And today has just been the climax, the wonderful final activity, I guess you call it. It was just wonderful. I loved it.
Let me ask you, you said 13 years. These 4 men have been working together for a long time now.
Very long time.
They know each other very well.
Yes.
How are they going to get along up there?
Wonderfully, I hope. It's going to be crowded.
You hope?
I hope. They're all four completely different individuals, but they've been working together for months and months, and they get along great, and they have great simulator days. So the real thing is going to be just as fantastic.
How about the 4 wives? How well do you all get along together, and how mutually supportive are you?
Very, very well. We all get together, and especially this last month, we've been talking about the problems that come up, obviously, before a flight, and our feelings, expressing our desires for the future, and just hopes, and we have each other to rely on.
Kit Obermeyer, Bev Brand, thank you very much for joining us on this very special day for you both. Thank you.
This has been a very special edition of today. We had considered it special all along with the Space Shuttle Columbia mission going off today, mission number 5. We've been monitoring events with that successful mission with the great help of Jane Pauley down there, who is live at the Cape. We'll be getting back to her momentarily.
Now configuring for the workload that's coming up, putting away certain chairs, and Joe Allen in the crew quarters is probably configuring, doing a little housekeeping, if you will, downstairs, getting ready for a 5-day stay. In the meantime, we're with Lieutenant General Tom Stafford. Now, he's here for a couple reasons. First of all, in 1979, he was a member of the Apollo-Soyuz joint Russian-Soviet mission. He flew up there with Deke Slayton, another astronaut, and the 3rd member of that team was Vance Brand, who was the commander of the Columbia. And on the ground, Capcom in Moscow, the communicator was Robert Obermeyer, so you know some gentlemen. To be specific, though, Lieutenant General Stafford met and talked with Leonid Brezhnev at least on 6 occasions, and the first time was particularly interesting. What was that?
Well, that was in 1971, Jane, when I was flown overnight to represent President Nixon at the state funeral of 3 cosmonauts that died when they returned from the space station. And I was thrust among all the top Soviet leadership. I didn't really see another American for 5 or 6 hours. And I ended up carrying the urn of the commander to put in the Kremlin wall, and right next to me walking was Mr. Brezhnev, carrying the urn. And what really impressed me, he was crying like a baby.
Crying?
He was very emotional about that.
What was your reaction to that?
Well, actually, it was sad for me losing a fellow space traveler, just going right to the funeral, but I was really amazed at his emotion.
This was in 1971. In 1975, as a member of Apollo-Soyuz, you had by then learned to speak the language.
Right.
Détente was in its heyday.
I guess I was the highest point of détente.
I guess you probably were. What happened? Détente has deteriorated steadily since 1975.
I think that was the high point of the total geopolitical relationship with the Soviet Union, and so it's been interesting to see the way it has gone. Of course, the question, what happens in the future? It was interesting to note the various moods that I watched the chairman in. My last meeting with him when I represented President Ford after the mission, Jane, he was very expansive. We traded presidents. I spoke to him in Russian for about 40 minutes with a slight Oklahoma accent. But he was very expansive, very outgoing.
How committed was he to space cooperation, or was that just a temporary...
Well, I feel that he was committed to space cooperation. Of course, they're always thinking in political terms, so if it was positive in a political term, he was committed to it.
You are retired now, left the Pentagon 3 years ago.
Right.
At that point, what was the concern at the Pentagon for the Soviet space station, the second, that is orbiting even as we speak?
Right. In fact, I guess Vance and Bob are going close to it in about 3 hours, about 60 miles away. Well, the concern is they have a continuing effort. You know, it's a steady effort and a continuing buildup to keep men in orbit full time, and it looks like they're going to meet that commitment.
So we'll see if anybody gets close enough to say hello. It's doubtful. As you say, space cooperation has deteriorated a good deal since 1975. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
And we're going back to New York, right?
Okay, defense information, and Mr. Robert Jastrow, who's former director of NASA Institute for Space Studies. Gentlemen, welcome. First, let me ask you, is our national security being jeopardized by what the Soviets are attempting to do in space?
I think that's probably the clearest aspect of the so-called arms race, because the Russians have tested 20 killer satellites, 10 of them successfully, and they now control space in a military sense. As a planetary scientist, I didn't know this myself until a few months ago when I did research on the matter. I was amazed to find they have a massive program in the military arena, and I think it's the most threatening and scary aspect of this whole problem.
Most think the fear comes from their ability to launch nuclear weapons from space, but is that a greater threat, or is it simply their ability to destroy our communication system?
No, it's the latter and other things. They have actually tested the delivery of bombs in orbit 6 times. But they don't have bombs in orbit at this time as far as we know. What they do have is an operational system of killer satellites that can knock ours out of the sky. And our communication satellites and our reconnaissance satellites are the most important element of our military position. So I and many other people find that very, very disturbing.
Admiral Carroll, does Mr. Jastrow overstate the problem? Is he exaggerating?
Yes, I'm afraid he is. The United States and the Soviet Union both have very active military programs in space, and the Soviets do have a limited anti-satellite capability. But it's only against low-orbit satellites where we have a very small portion of our presence in space. The United States, of course, is developing a much more sophisticated anti-satellite system which we will launch from our F-15 aircraft. The fact is, neither side can dominate space at this point, no matter how much money they spend. Whatever one side does, the other side will match. The defensive technology is much superior to the offensive technology, and neither side's going to gain any significant advantage in space.
Mr. Jastrow, given that, why should we boost our expenditures in defense space expenditures, I guess I should call it?
Because, again, the Russians have an operational system ready to deploy at any moment that can destroy our satellites. That includes our communication satellites, which fly in the altitudes in which they have this capability. And 75% of our military communications traffic now goes through space. Now, the Russians have the same problem, but they kept their landlines, and they're not vulnerable to this kind of development. We're very vulnerable.
Why not approach it from a defensive position, then, and say, instead, we will build better protective shields?
Because, unfortunately, we signed a treaty called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty that prevents us from doing that. I think it was an egregious mistake of the arms control process.
Mr. Jastrow and I don't agree on too much. The ABM Treaty is one of the outstanding successes of arms control and actually has worked to the benefit of both sides. He also gravely overstates the threat to our communication system at this point. Let's look at the alternative, which is to expand the existing outer space treaty with the Soviet Union and 89 other nations and block all weaponry in space. Let's
have the Soviets shown a willingness to expand
Absolutely. They have presented such a program to the United Nations, and it's been discussed in detail. By the way, let me finish.
Sure.
That may very much be a political statement, They may not mean it. They make all kinds of political statements, but the fact is they have made the offer, and it would seem to be in our interest to see if we
Of course, all that could change
off.
by events of today, and we would have to wait and see. But you obviously disagree that the Soviets would have the willingness, no matter who succeeds, Mr. Brezhnev.
Yes, the point that impresses me is that they say, sure, we'll talk, and they negotiate treaties, and meanwhile they build and build and build, and the military expenditures mount as ours go down, as they have until recently. And I can't see any connection between what they say and what they do.
What are you suggesting, that we boost the defense budget totally, or that a greater share of the existing defense budget be allocated for space?
I only know that we're doing the right thing at this time, which is that we have started to respond to that Russian threat in space. They now control space as a military area, but we are beginning to take steps to match them.
While disclaiming any need to reach a superior position, do you debate the fact that we have to, or the belief that we have to at least maintain parity with the Soviets?
We have to maintain an equal capability in space, but we can maintain an equal capability if neither side puts weapons in space, and that is still a possibility if we go into the negotiations.
Admiral Carroll, Robert Jastrow, thank you both very much for joining us on this day. Welcome.
To repair spacecraft, to refuel them. It's a basic part of the shuttle system to be able to go out and do an EVA. So this is our first try at it, and we're counting on this working, and then we have to do it on 11, and then on 13, flight 13, we do our first.
I fixed you something to eat. Shall I serve it?
You serve it to me now.
Coronet two-ply paper towels are surprising. They're soft, but they're very strong, even when they're wet. And if you think that's a surprise, they give you more towels on every roll than other national brands, 125 of them. So you get a lot, not pay a lot. Fact is, the more you use Coronet, the more you save. How much will you save? That's hard to say. How strong are they? That's easy to see. Extra value is what you get when you buy Coronet.
Be warned, men can't help acting on impulse. Impulse, the all-over body spray with the reassurance of a gentle deodorant, an irresistible fragrance you wear all over every day. So if a man you've never met before suddenly gives you flowers, that's Impulse. Impulse, the all-over body spray in 4 irresistible fragrances.
Time to make the donuts. The donuts.
It isn't easy owning a Dunkin' Donuts.
Time to make the donuts.
Because unlike most supermarkets, we make our donuts fresh day and night.
But the guys who make supermarket donuts are still in bed. Plain donuts aren't enough. 5 kinds.
Of course, when you make donuts this good, there is one reward. They taste so great.
Good morning, folks.
People buy an awful lot of them.
Tonight on It's New Night,
Archie Bunker's place.
Gary's rifle falls for Billy.
Is he a fox or what?
And Archie spills the beans.
You didn't know about this here.
Then on Foot in the Door, when Jonah can't stay out of hot water at home.
Hold on to your hat.
He moves to a bachelor pad.
Hot fish.
Great comedy tonight. Is apathy the criminal's newest weapon? Are people becoming numb to crime? A revealing report on the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather tonight.
It's out of our hands now.
John, don't say that.
You just know. These past few months, my beauty, they've been the happiest of my life. Listen to me.
I do.
Listen to me. If something should happen, I don't want you to close off your life. I want you to...
This is a CBS News special report. From Kennedy Space Center in Florida, here is CBS News correspondent Morton Dean.
Will the Challenger meet the challenge? That's the question that will be answered in just about 4 minutes and 35 seconds from now. The countdown has reached that mark. So far, it's been a relatively smooth countdown, the smoothness of the countdown contrasting with the troubles encountered over the past 3 months. A series of engine cracks and gas leaks were the main reasons for delaying this first flight of the Challenger from late January until today. Let's take a look at some of the vital statistics. It's planned as a 5-day flight. There are 4 astronauts on board: P.J. White, Story Musgrave, Donald Peterson, and Carol Bobko. Carol with a K. It's an all-male crew. Nestled in the cargo bay, folded away, is a huge communications satellite that will be launched from the shuttle about 10 hours after the shuttle is launched from the Kennedy Space Center. My co-pilot for this broadcast is Tony England, astronaut Tony England. Tony, this shuttle is the same as the Columbia, but it's also different from the Columbia, isn't it?
Yes, it looks like the Columbia, and it'll fly like the Columbia, but there are some very significant differences. We've got more powerful engines, and on the flight deck where the crew is living, it looks a lot different. We don't have the ejection seats in there, and the seats that we have are more like airline seats.
And all 4 astronauts on this flight, unlike the last one, all 4 are flying upstairs. No one is flying in steerage this time.
That's right. And we have a lighter vehicle, and that'll allow us to carry more into orbit. So we're getting more operational. We're going to put up heavier payloads.
It's about 3 minutes till launch, Tony, and also the tile protection system has changed. Okay, maybe we could just take a look at this. This is the old-fashioned tile. Oh, there it is. And this is the new-fashioned heat-resisting covering.
Right, it looks a lot like a quilt. And this isn't all over the vehicle. This is just on the OMS pods, those bulges on the aft end of the orbiter. On the next vehicle, we'll have that on the top of the wings also. So it's a great improvement. It's tougher. We don't have to be so careful with it. We hope that it'll make our turnaround quicker.
And Tony, with about 2 minutes and 30 seconds till launch, let's listen in and see if we can hear the voice of launch control, the voice of Hugh Harris.
And the vehicle now on its onboard supply.
That's that beanie cap.
The beanie cap, or gaseous oxygen vent arm, carries away vapors from the oxygen tank while the tank is full on the pad. Coming up on the 2-minute point in our countdown, the main engines have been moved to their start position, and the astronauts have cleared the caution and warning memories. T-minus 1 minute, 56 seconds, and the liquid hydrogen vent valve has been closed. Flight pressurization is underway. T-minus 1 minute, 45 seconds. At this point, the computer automatically verifies the readiness of the main engine.
4 astronauts on board. The 6th shuttle flight, the first of the Shuttle Challenger.
T-minus 1 minute, 30 seconds, and counting. The liquid hydrogen tank is now reaching flight pressure in approximately 5 seconds from now. T-minus 1 minute, 20 seconds, and counting. The liquid hydrogen tank is at flight pressure. Coming up on the 1-minute point in our countdown.
There will be another big event, Tony, on Thursday when 2 astronauts go for a spacewalk, the spacewalk that was canceled on the last flight because of malfunctions in 2 spacesuits.
And the hydrogen igniters under the
orbit. That's right. We're building a lot of our future on those EVAs.
These devices are used to ensure any hydrogen
Let's listen in now.
Flowing through the engines prior to engine ignition does not accumulate. T-minus 40 seconds and counting. We are just seconds away from switching command of the countdown to the onboard computers. T-minus 30 seconds and counting. We are go for auto sequence start. The hydraulic power units on the SRBs have started. T-minus 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10. We are go for main engine ignition. 7, 6. We have main engine ignition. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff of the orbiter Challenger and the 6th flight of the Space Shuttle.
Wow.
The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Look at that.
Challenger's underway.
About 104%. That was cleared tower.
Houston copies, Challenger.
A beautiful launch. Or so it looks from here.
throttles on all three main engines, coming down to 81%. Velocity 2,000 feet per second. Altitude 3.5 miles.
Looking good so far.
Downrange 2 miles. 1 minute elapsed.
We are broadcasting live from
Main
the
engine
Kennedy
throttle is
Space
going back to
Center.
104%. Challenger is go at throttle up.
Challenger, you're go at throttle up.
Roger, go at throttle up. Trajectory slightly depressed, no problem. Flight dynamics officer reports.
A beautiful liftoff into a bright blue, clear sky.
Challenger, Houston, we see you're slightly depressed. No problem.
Okay, Dick. Velocity 4,100 feet per second. Altitude 15 miles. Downrange 14 miles.
The launch was under the control of the Kennedy Space Center. The mission is now under control of the Johnson Space Center in
Velocity
Houston.
5,100 feet per second. 20 miles in altitude. Downrange 22 nautical miles.
And soon we should be able to see the separation of the solid rocket boosters pushing away from the shuttle.
Goes.
And there they go.
SRB-7 was that something.
Beautiful pictures.
We got an awful lot of crud on the windows at SRB-7, Dick.
Roger, we copy that.
And the astronauts report they saw that out of their windows.
Challenger, your first stage performance was nominal.
Good. Thank you. Guidance has
solid rocket boosters will fall into the Atlantic Ocean about 160 miles from the Kennedy Space Center and will be retrieved there.
Challenger, you have 2-engine tail capability.
2-engine tail.
Portions of the boosters are reusable. In fact, there are parts from the very first shuttle flight. On this flight, parts of the booster have been reused. Of course, that's the whole idea of the shuttle, reusability.
3 minutes elapsed time. Velocity 6,800 feet per second. Altitude 39 miles. Challenger.
How does it look to you, Tony?
Yeah, it looks beautiful. Yeah, it really looks good.
All three main engines still at 104%.
Makes you wish you were along.
Challengers go at 3 minutes 15 seconds.
Well, you'll have your chance soon enough.
One of these days.
Flight Director Jay Green taking a status check at all positions prior to Challenger reaching negative return point.
Negative return coming up. That means they cannot or will not return to the Kennedy Space Center in the event there is trouble with the engines.
800 feet per second.
The point of no
47
return.
miles altitude.
Right. In this region, if we have a problem, we'll go to Dakar.
To Senegal.
Challenger, your negative return.
And there's the announcement, negative return.
Challenger no longer able to return to the Kennedy Space Center.
Well, the engines, those troubled engines, are so far proving that they can do the job.
Altitude of 50 nautical miles, velocity 8,700 feet per second.
These engines are marvelous technology. It's fantastic that they're doing the job they're doing.
They are the most technologically advanced engines ever built, even more so than the Columbia. However, some cracks developed, and they had some leaks, a hydrogen leak, or several hydrogen leaks, and an oxygen leak, which caused this 2.5-month delay.
Altitude's 53.5 miles, 165 miles downrange. Challenger still go, all systems. All three main engines still at 104%.
It's a 5-day flight. They'll commute back to Earth next Saturday if all goes well.
10,400 feet per second. Altitude 55 miles, downrange 196 nautical miles.
Tony, in that this is not the real first in the shuttle program. It's the first of the seconds, I guess. It doesn't deserve an asterisk, but an asterisk, I guess, in the history of flight.
Commander Paul White's, the Challenger can now continue up.
Well, it's the first time we've had a two-vehicle fleet, so that is a first. Okay, if we lose an engine now, we can still make it to orbit.
What we're waiting for now is the closeout of that huge mustard color, some people say peach-colored, external tank, and after it goes dry, it will be jettisoned
5 minutes, 40
from the
seconds.
shuttle and will fall back toward the Indian Ocean. It's the one part of the shuttle that is not reusable.
Challenger, you have single engine TOW capability.
Single engine TOW.
Okay, if we lose 2 engines, now we can still make it to Dakar.
If 2 main engines fail. Velocity 13,000.
You were saying before the launch to me, I wonder what they're thinking now.
Yes.
Downrange 321
And I wonder what they're thinking now. P.J. White's, the commander, has been in space before, 28 days aboard a
computed for
Skylab mission.
20 seconds.
His colleagues are new to space travel, although they've been in the program for a considerable length of time.
15,000 feet per second. Altitude's 58 nautical miles. Downrange 364 nautical miles.
Yes, they've been working about 16 years for this mission.
6.5 minutes elapsed time.
Space buffs will note that there's a new launch voice at Mission Control in Houston, Jack Riley. John McLeish giving up the reins this time for the first time in several years. Tony, there are a number of experiments on board. While we listen in, perhaps you could touch on some of those.
Challenger 433.
Well, of course, the most exciting thing is the TDRS satellite that we're going to put up. In addition to that,
TDRS is astronaut talk for
I'm sorry.
Tracking and Relay Data System, or the other way around, Tracking and Data Relay System.
Satellite. Yes, we're going to put up 3 of those satellites eventually. And it'll replace most of our ground stations. And it'll give us something like 80% coverage while we're in orbit. So that's really the most exciting part.
And snow. They're going to make snow on this flight.
That's right.
Did you know that?
The Japanese have an experiment to make artificial snow, and they're interested in the symmetry of the crystals as they go in 0G.
Just a little bit of snow. There's no shovel on board, at least I don't think
that's
so.
right, and I understand they're not going to bring it back, just pictures of the snow.
Because it was a Japanese physicist who first invented or created artificial snow crystals.
That's right.
We are just about, what is it, about 30 seconds from main engine cutoff, which will certainly tell us that the shuttle is in space, although not yet in orbit.
58.5 miles. Downrange 629 nautical miles.
Again,
8 minutes.
from everything we've been able to hear and see, it's been a good flight.
It's been beautiful.
We copy.
It really has.
In just a few seconds, we should hear the call for MECO, main engine cutoff. A few seconds.
25,000 feet per second.
MECO. Outstanding.
Roger, we copy, and no problem with your cabin atmosphere.
There's the call, main engine cutoff, and now the external tank will be jettisoned.
Nominal MECO.
Comment on the atmosphere was as the cabin goes up, it expands, so the pressure inside drops, and we get an alarm. But that happens every mission.
And there are some marvelous pictures from an earlier flight. That's the big external tank when it was painted white, falling away from the Shuttle Columbia.
That's right. You see the parts that scorched from the heat.
And now we're going to take a few moments off, and then we'll be back for a few moments. Stay with us.
Doc. Okay.
Danny is coming up.
You're on, Morse. Okay, let's take a look now at some of the biographical information concerning the 4 men who are on board that flight. The commander of the mission, Tony, is P.J. White. As we mentioned earlier, he is a space veteran.
Yes, you bet. He flew on the first Skylab, and he's a real leader. I shared an office with him for a couple of years, and he's a nice fellow to work with.
And he's appeared on this broadcast with us in the past. Carol Bobko is his pilot. This is Carol's first flight.
And Bo is still in the Air Force. He's a colonel, and It's
he was one of the first Air Force Academy graduating classes.
That's
He's
right.
waited 14 years for this flight, and Dr. Story Musgrave, who is a Story in and of himself, isn't he?
You know, Story and I came on board in the same group, and Story's a fascinating guy. He just does everything from parachuting to flying airplanes to instructing. He's an MD. You name it, he does it.
He's an MD. He has a degree in math, business, physiology, and biophysics. And Donald Peterson is the fourth member of the crew. He's been in the NASA program for 14 years.
And Don is Colonel U.S. Air Force, retired, and he's a mathematics sort of his own, and he's a good member of this crew.
You know, Tony, when you look at their ages, I think from 47 to 50, this looks like a midlife crisis convention that's going to be going on there.
Well, that just tells you get better as you get older.
Yeah, it also says something about the program and the astronaut corps. Let us talk about what's going to occur later today. The big event is that launching of the communication satellite.
You bet. That a lot of our program hinges on the success of that launch and the success of the satellite when it gets up there. There's a lot of interest, to say the least, that it work.
And occurring right now, Tony, is what's called the OMS burn, and that is a burn of a small rocket engine that will place the shuttle in the type of orbit it's looking for, at least for now, and then another OMS burn of 2 or 3 or 4 will move it up to 175 miles above the Earth. OMS standing for
Orbit Maneuvering System.
There are 51 engines and rocket thrusters on the shuttle, but we should remember that none of them help when the shuttle comes home. It comes home as it goes up as a plane or a rocket.
Comes down as a glider.
Comes down as a glider with no engine power.
A glider a little bit like a brick, but still a glider.
Again, from everything we've heard, the mission goes well. It's still a all-male
We're going to fix that pretty soon.
Well, that's right. The next flight, Sally Ride will take a ride, and she will be the very first American woman to fly. The Soviets have had 2 women, I believe, fly in space, or is there only one?
No, 2. That's right.
2 women.
And we'll catch up with them with Flight 12.
And, of course, it's been an all-white flight history, too, and NASA will catch up on that with STS Shuttle 8.
That's right.
And a black astronaut will fly, the first black astronaut to fly in a U.S. space program.
1 minute elapsed.
Well, after about a 1.5 year delay, Tony, the Space Shuttle Challenger is finally on its way. We can imagine that NASA's sigh of relief was as loud as the roar of the launch itself. From what we've been able to see and hear as the curtain went up on this country's latest space spectacular, the show so far, the flight so far today, seems to rate a rave review. If all goes well, the Challenger and the astronauts, Weitz, Bobko, Musgrave, and Peterson, will commute back to Earth next Saturday, landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. My thanks to astronaut Tony England for his guidance and words of wisdom, not only during the broadcast, but before as well. I'm Morton Dean, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
6, we have main engine ignition, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff of the orbiter Challenger and the 6th flight of the Space Shuttle. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
School teacher, of course, riding along today, and apparently she has been lost. Also, members of her 3rd grade class were there with a banner that read, "Go, Krista, go." In Concord, New Hampshire, the high school had been assembled in an auditorium, 1,500 altogether, to watch on television this launch. And across the country, for that matter, young people have been watching what happened today, and it's bound to have a traumatic effect on youngsters as well as those of us who are grown-ups and think that we are used to the unexpected in life and find out that we are not. To help us deal with all that now is Dr. Ravenscroft, Ken Ravenscroft, who is from Georgetown University. He's a child psychiatrist. Dr. Ravenscroft, as a parent of youngsters, what would I say to them tonight as we discuss this around the dinner table?
Well, I think one of the major things actually is to find out, first of all, to let them know you're aware of what's happened, and then to find out from them what they've been through so far that day.
In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, a piece of the solid fuel rocket booster blown away in the explosion. The spaceship was throttling up at one of the most dangerous periods of the launch when the explosion occurred. Now, as you just heard a few moments ago from presidential spokesman Larry Speakes, earlier it was said, the President's Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, and others passed along the word the President would go ahead with his State of the Union address tonight. Larry Speakes then came out and confirmed some of what we reported to you earlier. The President has now decided to cancel his State of the Union address that was scheduled for tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Instead, in case you missed this in what Speakes said, instead President Reagan will speak to the American people tonight about the, and this is what the White House called it, the tragedy of the explosion aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. White House spokesman Larry Speakes said there will be no State of the Union address tonight. The State of the Union address will be made next week. President Reagan does plan to address the nation tonight about the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion today. At what time the President will be speaking tonight, we do not yet know. You are watching our CBS News live coverage of today's tragedy, of this explosion in space, this disaster in space. Our tentative plan, of course, is to broadcast the President's address to the nation, if that's what it turns out to be tonight, whenever that occurs. If there's something less than a full address, we simply don't know the form yet, and we don't know when it's going to take place. But President Reagan does plan to speak to the American people this evening, but about the Space Shuttle Challenger, his State of the Union address has, after some deliberation, and understandably it took the White House some time to decide what would be best in terms of State of the Union address, it has been postponed now until next week. Now, aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger, in that terrible fireball of this morning, were 7 Americans. And these were the 7 Americans aboard and who they were. Francis Dick Scobie, Air Force Major, was the commander, 46 years old, born in Washington State. Michael Smith, he was the pilot, age 40, United States Navy, born in Morehead City, North Carolina. Judy Resnick, second woman in space, 36 years old, PhD, born in Akron, Ohio, mission specialist. Ronald McNair, also a mission specialist, PhD, 35 years old, born in Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison Onizuka, Major, United States Air Force, 39 years old, born in Hawaii, also a mission specialist. These were all the astronauts. 41-year-old Gregory Jarvis, the payload specialist, man in charge of the cargo aboard the Space Shuttle. 41 years old, born in Detroit. And 37-year-old Krista McAuliffe, school teacher, mother of 2, from Concord, New Hampshire. While astronaut Judy Resnick was preparing for the flight, Judith Resnick, one of 2 women aboard the flight today, the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe was one, Judy Resnick was the other woman. While Judith Resnick was preparing for the flight, she talked about what it meant to be the second female astronaut.
Of the solid booster rockets. This again is the family. This is Christy McAuliffe, astronaut, or rather teacher McAuliffe's family there. Her mother, her father there, other members of the family. At first they didn't know what was happening. Then it became clear when they said they had a major problem, and then a tragedy indeed. It is the first loss of American life aboard in flight, aboard the shuttle or any other kind of spacecraft in flight. Of course, there was a tragedy back in January of 1967 when Virgil Grissom and 2 other astronauts died in a fire aboard an Apollo spacecraft. But since that time, there has been no loss of life until today, when we can only but sadly presume that 7 Americans, including the first school teacher, the first, if you will, regular person, regular citizen up in space, apparently have been lost. One of the next flights was going to be taking a journalist into space. As the program was very ambitious for this year, they hope to send as many as 15 shuttle flights. There have been delays on the first one. There were delays and on this one also, several days of delays because of weather, one thing or another. You'll recall yesterday the problem seemed to have been with a screwdriver that delayed him for some time, and by that time the weather was not very favorable. This morning there was the scheduled liftoff was 9:38 Eastern Time, but there was a problem there with the freezing temperatures overnight. It dropped below the freezing point, and icicles developed on the main body of the spacecraft. That concerned the officials at NASA a little bit, so they delayed the flight. They even sent some people there to chip off some of those icicles. Then they determined that it really wasn't going to be much of a problem. About 10 o'clock, it became above the freezing point, and they thought there would be no danger of the icicles during launch falling off and hitting the protective shield, those tiles. So nobody knows at this particular time what the problem was, but it is indeed a tragedy of the first magnitude in the space program. There's a lot of speculation that we've heard this afternoon of what this means to the space program. Obviously, there's going to be a delay while no launches ever takes place. That's an old NASA rule until they find out what happened on the last one, even if it's just a minor glitch. And of course, we have more than a minor glitch. We have a full-blown tragedy. Let's go back now to Washington, D.C. and Tom Brokaw. Tom?
Thank you, John. Dan Molina is in Houston now, and we each have, I think, a model of the space.
Happen. After several delays this morning, liftoff finally came at 11:38, and at first things seemed to be going smoothly. Then suddenly the $1.2 billion spacecraft burst into flames and fell into the Atlantic Ocean 18 miles southeast of the Kennedy Space Center launch pad. The debris continued to fall into the water for 45 minutes, and it was that long before rescue teams could safely approach the area. The last time American lives were lost in the American manned space program was back in 1967 when 3 astronauts died in a launch pad explosion during the Apollo program. And the shuttle disaster is a tragedy that moved everyone who saw it or heard about it. Friends called each other. Strangers felt the need to talk to each other about the accident. And reporter Ron Claiborne talked to one New Yorker who summed up the disbelief felt by so many.
Shock, disbelief, huge fireball, it's horrible, and you know, unexpected. Just you know, it just doesn't seem possible. You know, I thought they pretty much had this down pat, as you might understand, and I know I have a son that was very much interested in the space program, and I'm sure he must be wondering, because he's home too today, and I just think that it's a setback. You know?
Well, now officials must decide just how much of a setback this is for the U.S. space program.
In Space, Inc., that's a leading United States and international satellite and space insurance brokerage firm. It announced today, earlier, that it had donated a personal accident insurance policy to Sharon Krista McAuliffe. Krista McAuliffe, the high school teacher who will be the first private citizen to fly aboard the shuttle. The policy provides $1 million. All right, here we are now.
As I address you here this afternoon, at 11:40 a.m. this morning, space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. Members of Challenger are Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialist Dr. Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Dr. Ronald McNair. And payload specialists on board were Krista McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis. All early indications in the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area, approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
Mr. Moore has time for just a couple of questions from each center before returning to the effort in investigating this tragedy. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and your affiliation. And we'll start right here with Jacqueline Bolden from Channel 6.
There were some reports that the shuttle perhaps rose a little slower than in previous launches, and there seemed to be a loud noise, and then the noise kind of backed off, and then a rush of noise again. Did you get any reports from anyone else that this seemed different from the people who either experienced it, saw it here live?
I have not heard any reports at all relative to that effect that you just described. None whatsoever.
Okay. Up here in the third row, Michael.
My name's Kevin Hamilton from WGIR in Manchester. The entire Teacher in Space program was designed to introduce more people, specifically youngsters, to the space program. This obviously is not the introduction you intended to make. What do you think the effect, the long-term impact that this is going to have on the youngsters that you were hoping to attract?
Well, I think we'll have to address that as time goes on. And again, I think today, the events of the day makes it much too early for me to speculate on the long-term impacts.
Okay, Al Selstead from Baltimore Sun in the first row.
Mr. Moore, at this time, do you have any estimate of how much liquid fuel was in the external tank at the time of the explosion, and how much explosive power, say in terms of TNT, that remaining liquid fuel might have been equal to?
No, sir, not at this time. You realize what we've been doing since 11:40 this morning is we immediately pulled our senior management together in this program, and I formed an interim board to ensure that all relevant data to this event would be impounded and would be made accessible to the investigative people that will go and take a look at it. I can't answer your specific questions relative to how much fuel was on board at this point in time. The board, when it's formally reported by the administrator, formally formed by the acting administrator, I'm sure will go into those kinds of questions, but I can't answer it right now.
Okay, we're going to take one more question here before going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Here in the right opposite you, Jackie.
Peter Van Sant from CBS News. We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of any problems at all with any of the, with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, heater box, that had about a quarter of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired, and everybody, all the experts in the program, took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time.
Wait for the microphone. I have to have the microphone.
There was no damage to any tank, or this arm did not strike any tank as far as you know?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, we're going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Just a couple of questions.
This is the Johnson Space Center. We have a question from Paul Reeser, Associated Press.
Yes, Mr. Moore. Was there any debris of any description recovered by the vessels, and if so, what was it?
We do not have any detailed debris reports at this point in time. That certainly is something that we're looking at, and we will be impounding all the debris that we recover, and we've set up plans here to store that debris so that the investigating group can go in and look at that and assess that in great detail. I do not have any detailed reports right now on debris.
Bruce Nichols. Mr. Moore, with all the delays that you experienced last week, the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there? And who made the final decision to go?
We're going to the Marshall Space Flight Center for a couple of questions.
Martin Berkey with Huntsville Times. Can you tell me what this does to the schedule on down the line, including the launch at Vandenberg?
No, I'm not prepared to do that. What I have done is basically suspend operations for a few days till we can sit down and assess this. And, you know, we're obviously not going to pick up any flight activity until we fully understand what the circumstances were relative to this morning's launch. So in the interim, near-term time, we basically suspended operations until we get a handle on what our problems were this morning.
Nick Miller, WAFF Television in Huntsville. What part will Marshall Space Flight Center play in the investigation, since the propulsion system was the responsibility of the Space Flight Center here?
Well, they obviously have to play a very strong role in the investigating what happened this morning. As you know, the Space Shuttle program is built around a team effort, not only involving the Marshall Center, but also the Kennedy Space Center and the Johnson Space Center. All of the elements have different responsibilities, and clearly Marshall has the propulsive responsibilities on the shuttle. They will play a very dominant role, as will the other three centers I mentioned, as well as anybody that is contributing to the overall program and has some relevant information to add will certainly play a part.
Okay, we're moving to Washington for questions from NASA headquarters. Okay, there is a problem with our audio circuits to Washington. We are going to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena.
Bill Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times. Mr. Moore, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the appointment of this interim review board and said that it would be making statements from time to time. Not to put any adverse interpretations on this, it sounds a little bit like a news blackout, and I'm wondering if your objective is to consolidate information, what will be the point of issue of all those announcements in the future? And are other people not involved in that review board forbidden to talk?
Well, let me correct your statement. First of all, I said that I had appointed an interim review board. That interim review board is composed of the senior members of the NASA team here to take immediate actions on impounding data. The acting administrator is expected to appoint a formal review board very shortly, and it will be left up to that review board in order to determine its progress reports in terms of their findings. What we have done here today is to move very quickly so that all relevant data could be impounded and all actions that are needed to be taken in order to preserve as much information as we can on the circumstances of this morning can be preserved. And that's the nature of the work that I've implemented today, and I expect a formal board to be established very, very shortly, within the next day or so, by the acting administrator.
This is Roy Neal, NBC News. Jess, you've said, I believe, that future flights are temporarily frozen. The United States space program, as a result, is at a halt. Now, based on your experience, how long would you estimate that this investigation will take? 6 months, a year, before you get back in business?
Roy, it is, as you know, it is very difficult to estimate that time. It's going to be a function of what the board finds were the difficulties today and what corrective actions have to be taken before we feel confident and feel safe to fly again. And I clearly am not in a position to speculate today the length of time involved in making that determination. It will be done just as quickly as we possibly can. but also as prudently as we possibly can and as thoroughly as we possibly can.
One more question from JPL.
Bill Hines again. I've got to follow up on that first question of mine. I understand now that there will be announcements made after the permanent board is appointed. Is that correct?
There will be an announcement, I'm sure, of the members of the permanent board, yes. I believe that will be correct, and then I think that board will determine its rate of reporting based on the progress of its findings.
Okay, we're going next to the Washington NASA headquarters.
Are there any indications of sabotage or attack on the shuttle?
I'm sorry, we didn't read that question. And while they're repairing that circuit to Washington, we'll go to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland.
Mark Weaver, WBAL Radio in Baltimore. Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Ken Carroll from WDVM in Washington. Were there any unusual weather conditions aloft or any unusual weather conditions during the launch?
None that we observed that I recall. We did put up some weather balloons early this morning. We did look at load conditions as we normally do, and the winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge, and we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Mr. Moore, I.J. Hudson from WRC-TV. Has it become a problem that you have been too good in the past, that the American people have seen flawlessly perform missions on TV almost routinely, and that something like this happens all of a sudden, it hits home even harder?
Well, I don't know how to answer your question specifically. We always strive in every flight that we perform to be as reliable and as safe as we possibly can, and to do everything that we can to ensure that the vehicle and the systems are all ready to fly. Flight safety is our #1 priority in the Space Shuttle program. And certainly when you see an event like this morning, we are going to have to do a very detailed assessment of the set of circumstances to try to understand what occurred, and we will then in turn assess the impacts from that to determine where we go in the future.
I think you can hear it over the speaker.
Okay, back here at the Kennedy Space Center, we only have time for a couple more questions. Jay Barbary from NBC News in the front row here.
Jess, I would like to know if you know what happened to Challenger. Can we assume that it was consumed in the explosion? And can you tell us specifically what you know now that the recovery crew has recovered in the impact area?
I have not gotten a briefing, Jay, on what the recovery team has found at this point in time. And I have basically looked at the NASA select photos and so forth that you did, and all I can say is that it appeared from those photos that there was an explosion. And that's about all I can say at this point in time.
Okay, we have time for only one more question, and James Fisher from the Orlando Sentinel has had his hand up a long time.
Jess, I realize this is a rather forward-thinking question, but what is the situation with the Rockwell plant about the possibility for ordering another shuttle? Has the assembly line been shut down? What's the situation with that?
Well, as we've discussed in the past, we are manufacturing structural spares for an orbiter system, and that manufacturing process is continuing.
The LEM hatch has been sealed. The cabin has been repressurized.
Well, we can certainly say that the extravehicular activity has ended. They spent 2 hours, 13 minutes, 12 seconds on the surface of the moon, are back in Eagle, and are back relying on Eagle's systems to keep them alive.
In the background, a bit of static from mission control as ground controllers here wait for the men to move on to the communications system in the LEM itself rather than in the portable life support
And
system.
a replica of the American flag on the lunar surface is now being erected here in the control center.
That word from Mission Control.
I saw that flag in the corner over there a while ago. I was wondering about that.
And a replica of the plaque on Tranquility Base has been hung on the wall.
Altogether, inside and outside their moonship, Armstrong and Aldrin spent nearly a day in this strange, literally unearthly place. They did what they came to do.
In the 21st hour came the last real test. If Eagle's booster failed on liftoff, Armstrong and Aldrin would be condemned to drift for eternity on a tranquil sea of alien dust 250,000 miles from home. Again, utilizing film not seen until after Apollo 11's return to Earth, here is Eagle's liftoff from Tranquility Base on the surface of the Moon, July 21st, 1969.
Tranquility Base, Houston. Guidance recommendation is pings, and you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 7, 6, 5, port stage, engine arm ascent. Beautiful. 26, 36 feet per second up.
Liftoff from the Moon, perfect. Ahead, rendezvous with the command ship, a return to Earth, and the adulation of the world for 3 modest men, unlikely achievers of the impossible dream.
2,600 feet altitude. Eagle Houston, you're going right down the track. Everything's great.
The rendezvous chase in which Eagle would catch up with Columbia would take more than 3 hours. Eagle and Columbia would rejoin. Armstrong and Aldrin would crawl through a connecting tunnel and rejoin Collins. Half a day later, Apollo 11 would break out of lunar gravity and head for home.
NBC promoted its television coverage of the moonwalk with the line, "The longest journey begins with a single step." The step, of course, was the one taken by Neil Armstrong. Yet, in a sense, that step was not a beginning, but one in an astounding progression of adventures in space. How can we think of Apollo 11 without thinking of visionaries like Copernicus and Galileo, Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, Robert Goddard, Wernher von Braun, or the multitude of travelers, Gagarin, Grissom, Glenn, Christa McAuliffe. All of them have been part of a continuum that extends back for centuries and will continue on into the future. And in that continuum, in which all may never be said and done, the one step that will probably stand as the single most dramatic will be the giant leap taken on a warm summer night 20 years ago, when Earth first landed a man on the moon. I'm Edwin Newman for the A&E Cable Network. See you on the afternoon of July 24th, when we'll bring you the splashdown of Apollo 11.
180 miles high. The shuttle always flies east, but there are windows all around the cabin. Out the window on our left stretches the east coast of the United States, from Long Island to Atlantic City and the long arm of the Chesapeake Peninsula. But the boot and heel of Italy are like a map come to life. Further east, Greece and the Aegean Sea.
I grew up a sort of amateur, avid geographer, always poring over maps, always wondering about the world and studying different places. So I was sort of steeped in maps and geography from day one, and kind of fluently knew our ground track before I ever launched on my first flight. That was not true of all my crewmates, but I was very impressed to observe on a couple of...
But my first flight, I was lost all the time.
We're coming up here onto the Namib Desert in southwestern Africa. Those dunes may not look too terribly impressive in this scene, but they're actually hundreds to, in some cases, about 1,000 feet high. And again, you see signs of cold water offshore over which that dense, low-lying cloud has formed. This is the area that the 17th and 18th century sailors, 19th century sailors used to call the Skeleton Coast, and it becomes kind of easy to tell why when you see how desolate it looks.
This is one of my favorite views because you're looking at the Horn of Africa, the big chasm between Africa and Asia, where, you know, plate tectonics have caused one continent to separate away from the other. And it's most vivid in that particular region of the world, more so than any other place I can remember, where you get the feeling that you can actually see these two continents in real motion, real time, pulling away from each other.
The Middle East, the Nile River in Egypt, and the fork of the Red Sea that shapes the Sinai Peninsula.
In talking to kids, I say it's real important to study math and science, but it's also important to study history and to understand history. And in that very shot, you know, we have the history of mankind. And just about every kid, no matter what his religious background is, have heard about people like Moses. And, you know, you say, well, what do you know about Moses? And they say, well, I think that's the kid that, you know, his mother put him in the basket and put him out. And I said, okay, see that river right there? That's the very river. And if you follow up the river, if you go up it a little bit, you